She walked the petitioner's disc the way a woman walks toward a grave she has already dug. The heavy platform sank 3 meters into the stone floor with a wet, heavy shudder. High above her, the bone-stone walls of the Velani imperial diet caught the sound and multiplied it into 100 sharp echoes. 47 galleries leaned forward to watch a human woman receive the verdict that 218 of her countrywomen had been lawfully hanged. They sat under the 42-meter ceiling, waiting to enjoy whatever shape her collapse would take. Speaker Ororn Veshdal lifted the sealed stone tablet. He cleared his throat sac, which flushed a deep, stressed violet under the high chamber lights. The judicial rank notches on his bone facial ridges rattled like dry twigs as he looked down at her. His voice boomed through the open air without any microphones, carrying the final judgment across the vast hall. The decree was simple. The executions carried out 37 years ago on the Kelt orbital pens were legally sound. The galactic laws had been followed. The human race was entitled to no legal remedy, no return of remains, and no apology. From the third gallery box, Father Elias Korhonen Sigfason watched the speaker's 6-fingered hands lower the tablet. Elias felt the skin on his face tighten. Without realizing it, his left thumb reached over and pressed twice against the inside of his left wrist. It was the exact spot where his metal watch used to sit before he stopped winding it on the day the transport ship was boarded. Below him, the entire assembly remained perfectly still. 10,000 alien representatives held their breath, waiting for the human diplomat to scream or beg or fall to her knees. No screams, no pleas, no movement at all. Director Yusra Halabisarki stood exactly where she had landed. Her long gray coat remained buttoned to the chin, hiding the slight frame underneath. With smooth, glacially slow movements, she unclasped a small brass-collared thermos from her belt. She unscrewed the lid with 3 quiet clicks of the flat rubber gasket. The sharp, bitter scent of oversteeped rosemary tea drifted into the immediate air, cutting through the heavy smell of recycled copper air conditioning. She poured the dark liquid into the small metal cap, her hand entirely steady as the hot water hissed against the rim. The entire Imperial Assembly watched in total disbelief as she took a slow, deliberate sip. She forced the rulers of 47 worlds to wait through her silence. Would you have broken, or would you have waited 37 years in the dark, because Earth did not break? Stay with me. 37 years before the tea drop hit the floor, Tycho Farside Vault 7 smelled of lime-crusted copper kettles and damp printer toner. The room sat deep within the lunar bedrock, illuminated by a single unshaded light bulb that hummed at 60 hertz. It was a small basement office that did not exist on any official budget sheet. A map of the solar system was drawn in gray pencil on the back of a grocery poster, taped to the wall so it could be torn down and burned in less than 90 seconds. 7 metal chairs stood crowded around a dented folding table. The kettle on the small electric burner gave a long, whistling hiss. Dr. Imran Akafradesina did not look up from his papers, but his right hand moved automatically. He tapped the ceramic rim of his empty mug 3 times with his knuckle, counting the high frequencies of the steam. Beside him, Colonel May Lynn Castellanos Reyes was working on her own silent routine. She folded a yellow paper napkin into a tight, 6-creased square, smoothing the edges with her thumbnail until the lines were perfectly straight. 22 years of tracking imperial supply lines through the outer rim had taught her that survival meant leaving no footprint behind. Across from them sat Eiko Renner Mizuki, the communications officer. She was hum-singing a single low, flat note under her breath as her ink pen moved across a lined ledger page. It was the same steady sound she had used for years as a hospice nurse to quiet the breathing of patients whose lungs were failing. The cell did not use the word war. For months, they had only referred to their presence in the basement as the work. The heavy vault door groaned as it swung inward on ungreased iron hinges. Yusra Halabisarkis walked into the room, her boots caked with gray lunar dust that drifted off her trousers in small, weightless clouds. She took off her dark coat and set a brand-new brass-collared thermos on the center of the table. A single date was freshly scratched into the brass rim with a pocket knife. The 7 people in the room stopped moving, their eyes fixing on the small container. Father Elias leaned back in his steel chair and reached for a tin box on the corner shelf. "Does anyone want a shortbread?" he asked, his voice low and formal. "The delivery man left them by the airlock this morning." Tomas Velderickson reached across the table and took 2 biscuits, the dry crumbs catching in his thick blonde beard. "I only meant to take one," he muttered, staring at his hand. Aiko stopped her humming for a brief moment. "You always say that, Tomas," she said softly. The small group laughed for 9 seconds. It was a thin, dry sound that barely filled the concrete room, and it vanished into the corners of the vault before the kettle could finish cooling. Operation Long Patience began that night in 2089, 4 months after the first messages from the orbital pens went dark. The response was not logged into any central military mainframe. It was kept entirely within those 7 pairs of hands, living around a single shared table. The human public on Earth knew nothing about Vault 7. For 3 decades, the news cycle spoke only of trade agreements, cargo tariffs, and diplomatic visits to the Outer Rim. The Dominion had tested the new human arrivals with a calculated cruelty, and Earth had simply absorbed the blow without launching a single missile. The Imperial generals in the high spires of Vale Karash looked at the data and recorded their findings. They believed the lack of immediate retaliation was proof of physical weakness. They mistook the silence for fear. Yusra spent those 37 years traveling through the deep black of the outer colonies, but she never went to the high halls of the Galactic Concord. She did not draft petitions for the Council of 12 to ignore. Instead, she took transport ships to the Broken Rim worlds, visiting the species that the Dominion had chewed up and cast aside over the last 2 centuries. Her first stop required a 4-week voyage to the dust clouds of the Kelt system. The small-statured, downy people lived in vast, hollowed-out asteroids that smelled of wet straw and cold grease. Their history was entirely oral, recorded only in long, multi-generational songs that recounted the lineages of the dead. Yusra sat on the stone floor of a cold memory hall for 2 hours without speaking a single word. She listened to the elders sing the names of 11,000 children who had vanished during the orbital pen purges. When the last song ended, the hall fell into an immense, freezing silence. The Kelt first singer turned her black, lidless eyes toward the human diplomat, waiting for the standard words of pity that foreign politicians always brought. Yusra did not offer pity. She reached into her bag and laid a single sheet of rough white paper on the floor between them. "We have waited as long as you have," she said. Her voice remained completely flat, devoid of any theatrical grief. "The ledger is still open." The old singer stared at the paper for a long time. Then, she leaned forward and pressed her small, 3-fingered palm against Yusra's bare wrist. "Yes," the singer whispered. The word was a dry rasp that carried the weight of a century of waiting. From the Kelt territory, Yusra took a mining freighter down to the deep ocean trenches of the Surin worlds. The blue-skinned, guild people had once been mineral poets, carving intricate architectural epics into the mountain ranges of their home. Now their planet was completely strip-mined, the surface a jagged wasteland of gray slag and boiling salt marshes. The Surin ambassador met her in a submerged iron ballast tank that vibrated with the heavy thud of imperial water pumps overhead. The ambassador used a long glass rod to show her the lines of a mineral poem carved into the tank's rusted bulkhead. It described a continent that had been turned to gravel in less than 9 months. Yusra did not look at the rod. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sealed glass jar filled with red Damascene soil from her own garden. She set it on the wet iron shelf between them. She did not explain what the dirt meant or where it had come from. The Surin ambassador reached out with his webbed fingers and touched the cold glass of the jar. He looked at the rich, dark earth inside, then looked up at Yusra's graying hair. He understood the language of lost ground. Without a word, he took the glass rod and scratched his formal mineral mark at the bottom of the white paper she provided. Tension within the outer rim began to shift in small, invisible ways. A delivery truck would arrive at an isolated signals post 3 minutes late. A cargo manifest in a Galactic colony would list 2 fewer crates of dried grain than the inspectors had stamped. The changes were too small for the Imperial sensors to notice, but they were regular. They were building a framework behind the stone. The third signature required 3 days of negotiation in the underground root cities of the Galactic. The triocular, fur-tufted elders sat in their low agricultural chambers, their vast bookkeeping ledgers spread across tables made of packed dirt. 3 of their grandest off-world settlements had been erased from the galactic charts 20 years ago because of a tariff dispute. The elder in charge of the eastern sectors read through the human dossier with all 3 of his wide eyes, his fingers tracing the columns of handwritten numbers. "You are asking us to risk the remaining 4 colonies," the Galactic elder said. His throat gave a low, rumbling click that rattled the small cups of sea dale on the table. "If your calculations are wrong by even a single digit, the Dominion will turn our fields into glass. Will their civilian ships be touched?" "Not one," Yusra replied. She sat perfectly straight in her wooden chair, her hands folded over her knees. "Our work is only with the hands that held the rope." The elder picked up a small bone stylus and dipped it into a well of thick blue ink. He wrote his name at the bottom of the ledger sheet with 3 heavy, decisive strokes. "The fields have been empty since my brother was small," he murmured. "Take the names." The work accelerated. In one long, grueling day that lasted 28 standard hours, Yusra crossed the border stations of 3 more worlds. She met the matriarchal priestesses of the Mura inside an unlit cargo container that smelled of rotting fruit. The head priestess recited the names of 14 sisters who had been executed in 2071, her voice remaining at the exact same pitch from the first name to the last. She signed the paper without asking for a single guarantee. From there, Yusra traveled to the orbital scaffolding, where the gaunt, 4-armed Volnir engineers spent their lives building Imperial warships they were never allowed to crew. The engineer elder did not offer weapons or soldiers. Instead, he handed over a small data chip containing the structural blueprints for 19 different types of habitat life support systems. "When the metal falls," the old engineer whispered, his lower arms twitching in a rhythm of old anxiety, "the refugees will need air before they need laws. Build the houses first." By midnight, she was sitting on a rusted oil drum inside the docking bay of the Ayari Station Council. The Ayari were stateless refugees who had no homeworld left to defend, living in a loose network of 19 crumbling outposts. Their representatives asked for nothing but a promise that the new generation would be taught how to build their own tools. When Yusra nodded, the station chief signed the ledger using a piece of charcoal from a cooking fire. The 4th week brought her back toward the core systems, to a quiet courtyard in Reykjavik, where the cold rain fell without any wind. The stone under her boots was black and slick with moisture. She met the ambassador of the Genu, the smallest sentience known to the conquered, whose entire population of 400,000 individuals could fit inside a single orbital habitat. Their representative was a child by human standards, his skin the color of old paper. The child looked at the heavy folder of signatures Yusra carried under her arm. "Is a people this small allowed to say yes?" he asked, his voice nearly lost beneath the sound of the rain hitting the cobblestones. "The size of the yes," Yusra said, reaching down to steady the child's wet umbrella, "is not measured by the size of the mouth. If you sign, the ledger protects you too." The child took the pen with both hands and drew a single thin circle at the edge of the white page. The final name on the list was the hardest to obtain and the most dangerous to carry. Yusra traveled to a private villa on the moon of Vale Karesh itself, where the air smelled of dried lilies and ancient stone dust. Inside sat Elder Saniri Veshtau. She was 860 years old, a retired imperial magistrate and the older sister of Speaker Ororn himself. Her pale facial ridges were worn smooth by centuries of judicial service, and her six-fingered hands were covered in thin, silver scars from old ceremonial ink rings. The old woman spent 4 hours reading through the handwritten logs of Operation Long Patience. She did not call her guards. She did not look up at the security cameras hidden within the carved stone ceiling. When she reached the final page, she placed her flat palm over the list of the 218 dead human women. "My family built the gallows," Saniri said. She spoke in perfectly unaccented English, her voice carrying the dry authority of a woman who had written 1,000 laws. "I will hold the door." She reached into her ceremonial robe and pulled out a small silver drive. It contained the unencrypted civilian shipping schedules for the entire sector, the internal timetables for the Imperial Diet's next 3 sessions, and the exact radio frequency that the military fleet used to authenticate friendly contacts. When Yusra returned to the lunar basement that night, she did not pop a cork or call for a toast. She took the 8 signed sheets of white paper and slid them into a plain brown folder labeled with a gray pencil mark that read, "The Forgotten." Father Elias took the folder from her hand. He turned around and placed it on the lower wooden shelf, right next to the thick paper log containing the names of the dead women from the kelp pens. The room remained completely quiet, save for the low hum of the unshaded light bulb overhead. "The frequency is active," Aiko said from her communications desk. Her finger was resting on a black toggle switch. Naledi Brandt broke the fleet authentication protocol in 2114, and she told no one before she died. 12 years of absolute silence wasn't a delay, Director. It was load-bearing architecture. "We are ready," Colonel Castellanos Reyes said. She did not look up from her napkin, which was now a perfect, sharp-edged paper square. "The 84 hulls are in position behind the shadow lines of the outer gas giants. Their cold burn drives are running at 3%. They have no gravitic signature, no heat leak, and no emissions. The Imperial scanners think they are just chunks of frozen methane." Yusra reached down and picked up her brass-collared thermos from the center of the folding table. She ran her thumb over the flat rubber gasket, feeling the small date scratched into the metal rim. "Then we are done with the waiting," she said softly. "Pack the papers. It is time to go to the Diet." The timeline looped back completely to the morning of the final trial. The 42-meter bone-stone chamber of the Imperial Diet was packed to the limits of its galleries. Speaker Ororn Veshtau stood on his high judicial dais, his ceremonial collar catching the white light of the chandeliers. The 1041 capital verdicts inscribed on his silver links gleamed as he raised his hands to signal the end of the session. Below him, inside the 3-meter lowered petitioner's disc, Yusra Halabi Sarkis set her small porcelain teacup down on the iron rail with a soft, distinct click. The sound was tiny, but the bone-stone walls caught it and carried it up through every level of the gallery boxes. Speaker Ororn looked down, his bioluminescent throat sac flushing a violent, irritated purple as he realized the human woman had not wept. He opened his mouth to order the guards to clear the floor, his 6-fingered hand reaching for the ceremonial gavel. A sudden chill went through the air inside the chamber, followed by a low, vibrating hum that made the stone floor shake. The grand display screens that lined the upper galleries flickered once, twice, and then turned a solid, blinding white. Speaker Ororn Veshtau froze on his high judicial dais. The heavy silver gavel in his 6-fingered hand remained suspended in the middle of the air. Around the edges of the grand chamber, the main display screens did not show the standard imperial seal anymore. They grid-flashed with a stark, cold white glare that hurt the eyes. A low, wet hum vibrated through the core of the floor, rattling the small porcelain teacup Yusra had placed on the iron rail. The massive hall, which had spent 10,000 years listening to the sounds of smaller species begging, fell into an absolute quiet. Elias watched from the upper gallery box as the speaker's pale facial ridges twitched. The judicial rank notches along the old alien's jaw gave a light, dry click. It was the exact sound of a magistrate realizing his court had lost its walls. Below them, on the sunken petitioner's disk, Yusra did not look up at the screens. She simply stood with her hands deep inside her gray coat pockets. Her thumb ran over the small date scratched into the brass metal of her thermos, counting the seconds. The white light on the screens was not static. It was the live broadcast feed from the outer gas giants, forced onto the Imperial network by the silver drive Elder Soniri had surrendered the night before. Far beyond the planet's atmosphere, inside the freezing dark of the inner perimeter, 84 human ships sat in a perfect, silent line. They carried no heavy missile tubes. They had no thick armor plating. Their cold-burn engines gave off no heat for the Imperial sensors to track. They looked like small chunks of frozen stone drifting through the black. Tomas Velderickson sat in the command chair of the lead human hull, his thick fingers resting flat against a plain wooden terminal. He did not look at a digital screen. He looked down at a single sheet of white paper containing handwritten numbers. Beside him, the communications console gave a single, high-pitched beep. It was the authentication frequency of the Velani military fleet, wide open and waiting after 12 years of total secrecy. "The loop is closed," Tomas said. His voice was a low growl that barely carried across the narrow steel bridge. He did not call for an attack order. He did not use a grand military title. He simply reached out and flipped a small black toggle switch that had been installed 3 days ago. The 84 hulls released a single coded pulse. It was not a beam of concentrated light. It was not a kinetic slug meant to break a metal hull. The pulse was an exact imitation of the Imperial fleet's own digital handshake, carrying the cracked keyring Naledi Brandt had found before her death. Every single warship broadcasting the grand military signature received the same order at the same instant. The order told the ships that their neighbors were hostile. It told the reactor networks to secure their own cores by venting the uncontained plasma directly into the primary fuel lines. The collapse began at the outer edge of the defense line. 500,411 military hulls decided all at once to stop being ships. The light they made was not red or angry. It was a cold, sharp blue-white that filled the viewscreens like a star, deciding privately to die. Aisha had been 7 years old when her mother was taken from the kelp pens. She used to like drawing small animals with white chalk on the rough floorboards of her family's mining shack. Now, 37 years later, she stood on the observation deck of a civilian cargo liner, her hands pressed flat against the thick glass window. She watched the grand Imperial warships around her transport turn into silent rings of gray dust. The civilian ship did not shake. The hull did not record a single scratch from the blast. The white rings of debris expanded through the dark like smoke from a dying fire, passing around the transport without touching a single plate. Hospital vessels passed through the expanding clouds of gray iron like white swans moving through a sudden winter snowstorm. Their crews stood at the bridge railings, staring down at their instruments in total disbelief. The military cast of the Velani Dominion had been wiped out in 19 minutes, but the supply lines remained entirely intact. The civilian infrastructure was untouched. The family ships of the 47 vassal species continued their journeys through the sector, their navigation grids completely unblocked for the first time in 2 centuries. Inside the high diet chamber, the live feed showed the last cluster of military masts fading into gray mist on the grand screens. Speaker Ororn Vestal was screaming into his communications handset, his bioluminescent throat sac flushing a deep, panicked violet under his ceremonial collar. He hammered his 6-fingered fist against the wooden console, but the line remained completely dead. The network his family had built to broadcast their verdicts across 40 worlds was no longer connected to anything but the human feed. They listened, they signed, they waited. The representatives of the 7 broken species rose from their seats in the lower galleries. The downy Celt elders stood first, their black eyes reflecting the white light of the dying screens. Beside them, the blue-skinned Surin ambassadors reached down and picked up their stone-carving rods, their gilled chests moving in a slow, even rhythm. The triocular Baalak elders did not say a word, but their thick hands closed over their ledger books with the force of an iron lock. They did not shout in triumph. They did not launch a single threat toward the high dais. The silence of the assembly room grew until it was heavier than the stone walls. Yusra Halabisarkis took her hand out of her coat pocket. She reached down and picked up her small porcelain teacup from the rail, draining the last drop of the rosemary tea. Her movements were still smooth, unhurried, and cold. She did not look up at the thousands of alien faces staring down from the gallery boxes. She walked across the 3-meter lower disc, her boots making a soft, regular thud against the black stone floor. She stopped at the bottom of the 8 bone-stone steps that led toward the speaker's dais. Ororn Veshtal looked down at her, his 6 hands shaking against his heavy silver chains of office. The lifetime achievement count of 1,041 capital verdicts inscribed on his collar seemed to drag his shoulders toward the desk. He had no more laws to read. He had no more ships to call. "Earth has heard the diet," Yusra said. Her voice did not rise in pitch. It carried through the vast hall with the flat, liturgical weight of a funeral service. "By dawn, your turn." She turned her back on the high dais and walked toward the grand exit doors. Behind her, a shadow moved from the high ring of the imperial benches. Elder Saniri Veshtal, 88 decades old, rose from her family's carved seat. She did not look at her brother. She descended the 8 steps her grandfather had commissioned, her smooth bone ridges pale under the dying white screens. She walked down into the sunken petitioner's disc and took her place exactly where the human diplomat had stood. The heavy iron doors did not close behind them. The secondary signals line on Naledi's mast gave a short, double click 3 minutes after the exit. It was an unlogged transmission from the deep outer rim, a tiny loop of code that was not part of the primary operation. In the far corner of the Surin territory, 3 small salvage vessels changed their course toward an abandoned Imperial weapons depot. They carried no human crew, but their navigation computers were running on software that had been written in the Tycho basement 12 months ago. The ledger had closed its first page, but the ink on the next sheet was already wet. The transition to Earth's actual dawn was marked by the sound of gray water hitting black cobblestones. It was raining in Reykjavik, a cold, heavy drizzle that came down from the northern sky without any wind to bend it. The courtyard was small, hidden behind the high granite walls of an old stone church that had stood through 4 human wars. No television cameras stood near the gate. No government officials carried long papers across the square. Father Elias Korhonen Sigfusson stood before a fresh granite slab that had been set into the wet dirt the night before. The stone was dark, its face engraved with 218 human names in plain Arabic numerals. 4 of the names at the bottom of the center column carried small, unpolished crosses next to the lettering, the 4 pregnant women whose children had died before they could receive a name. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn paper log with a gray pencil stuck through the string binding. His thumb touched his bare left wrist twice, his skin cold from the rain. He opened the first page and began to read the names aloud into the empty square. Miriam Al-Sarkis, Elias read. His voice was soft, rhythmic, and clear. He paused after the name, letting the sound fade into the hiss of the rain against the granite. Hannah Renner, Elena Castellanos, Sarah Akafer. The reading took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Beside him, the 7 ambassadors of the Coalition of the Forgotten stood in a silent circle, their various garments soaking through with the gray Icelandic water. The downy fur of the Celt singer was matted down against her neck, but she did not move her hand from the stone. The blue-skinned Surin representative held the small jar of Damascene dirt close to his chest, his gills closed tight against the cold air. Behind them stood Saniri, her silver ink rings catching the dull gray light of the winter morning. The international bodies in the high spires of Geneva had already issued 3 statements of grave concern, but the papers meant nothing in the courtyard. The 47 vassal species had not filed a single protest with the conquered. Their civilian leaders had already sent a short, handwritten message through Saniri's private channel, asking for a meeting to discuss the grain distribution routes across the outer rim. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. "We are not a vengeful people," Yusra said. She stood at the edge of the granite slab, her long gray coat dark from the rain. She did not look at the ambassadors as she spoke. She looked at the letters carved into the stone. "We are a patient one. The difference is only visible at the end. 37 years ago, we decided that the next species the Dominion hanged would be the last. We did not say it to the galleries. We did not write it on your tablets. We built it quietly, the way you build a house for a child that has not yet been born." She reached out her hand and took the brass-collared thermos from her belt. The rubber gasket was flattened and gray from 3 decades of use. She did not unscrew the lid this time. She set the heavy metal flask down on the top of the granite monument, right above the first row of names, where the cold rain could pool over the scratched date on the rim. "Today the house is finished," she whispered. Her breath made a small cloud of white mist in the gray air. "Tomorrow we teach the coalition how to build their own vault rooms. No one will ever have to wait 37 years again." Within 90 standard days, the signals from the outer rim changed their shape completely. 3 different species had already cleared out the basement levels of their old mining stations, stocking the rooms with iron kettles, paper ledgers, and shortbread tins that were filled each Thursday by people who asked no questions. The human cell at Tycho Farside Vault 7 remained empty, the pencil map on the wall already turned to white ash inside the incinerator. The new vaults did not share their coordinates with Earth. They did not sign any grand treaties with the conquered. They simply kept their own lists in the dark, writing the names by hand with gray pencil lead on plain white sheets. "We will not hide, we will not beg. But we will remember." Yusra turned away from the black stone monument and walked toward the iron gate of the courtyard. She did not look back at the brass thermos she had carried through 3 continents and 4 wars. The object sat entirely still on the wet granite, its surface turning dark under the steady downpour. The rain fell on the letters, on the metal cap, and on the empty square. The small circle of ambassadors remained behind her, their boots silent on the wet cobblestones as the gate clicked shut. The gray water ran down the face of the monument, pooling inside the deep cuts of the numbers, until the names were completely filled with the reflection of the sky. The iron gate stood cold in the rain. The retreating footsteps faded into the sound of the water on the black stone. The brass rim glowed once under the gray clouds, then went dark as the morning turned to noon. The empty vessel stayed on the granite.